Podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today, we got a doozy of an episode for you today. 6 stories this week of some very real, very funded, very far along in the process government projects that some of which still go on today, some of which are absolutely bonkers. This is the second time we've done an episode like this. The first one way back in episode number 73. But these might be more ridiculous than the first time we went through this. So we are looking at Operation Bumblebee, Exercise Robin Sage, Project A119, Project Fantasia, Aunt Jemima, and our first story will be of the Bat Bomb.
Story time. Story time. Story time. Story time.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, a guy named Little S. Adams knew that he needed to help his country. The problem was that he was like this dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania, and he was older enough. Like, he wasn't like this elderly dude, but he was old enough that like he wasn't able-bodied enough to be able to join the military and go fight in combat. But he did have a brilliant idea. During a previous visit to Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico, Adams saw the massive population of bats that live in these caverns, and he wondered, if bats like those that lived in the caverns could potentially be weaponized, right? Because it's not the first time that, countries, whether it was America or others, had potentially experimented with weaponizing animals in some way. The first time we did this, we covered Project Acoustic Kitty, where the United States, outfitted, it was either the United States or Russia to spy on the other one. They outfitted a cat with like a very primitive radio wire listening device. And then the cat just ran out in the street and got hit by a car. But they were going to weaponize that and use animals. There's some other ones, I think, mosquitoes have been used as, weaponized research tools before. Ticks, I think, just all kinds along the way. Dolphins, I think there was a experiment to potentially weaponize dolphins back in the day. But anyway, so in January 1942, Little Adams wrote a letter to the White House and explained his plan. And I don't know if maybe the White House still at the time was not as busy as maybe you would want them to be in the height of World War II, but they had enough time to read this guy's letter. And Adams kind of suggested like, hey, because bats often roosted before dawn, and because most of the buildings in Tokyo were made of wood, you could theoretically attach time-released incendiaries to thousands of bats and then cram them into a bomb and then kind of just let that bomb release them over the city after dark. And, before sunrise, all of those bats would find the wooden buildings in Tokyo, roost in them just in time for the timers to detonate. The bats are goners, which whatever, and Tokyo would then burn to the ground. And Adams was like, listen, you guys, bats are, quote, the lowest forms of animal life. And no one has like any real kind of explanation for why they even exist in the first place, other than to control other animal populations. Like they control like mosquito populations and other kind of bug populations. Like they are actually kind of beneficial for the ecosystem, but whatever. It's the 1940s. They wouldn't have known this yet. Adams also said that bats had been, quote, created by God to wait this hour to play their part in the scheme of free human existence and to frustrate any attempt of those who dare desecrate our way of life. So basically what you've got here is this guy, this dentist in Pennsylvania, which again, if you still, after last week's episode, if you still needed a reason to not trust dentists, now you've got this dentist who's like, bats don't exist for any real reason other than that God created them for this exact moment to burn Tokyo to the ground. Dude was huffing way too much nitrous oxide for sure. Here's the crazy thing. After consulting with a Harvard zoologist who was an expert in bats named Donald Griffin, President Franklin Roosevelt approved this plan. Like, and again, I want to kind of try to sympathize a little bit. Like, these are the most unprecedented times, right? Like, the world is at war again. It feels very apocalyptic, right? Because now we've got jets and there's a lot of airplanes, a lot of bombs being used, and there's so much destruction. And now the Japanese, and the Germans, they are potentially going to take over the entire world. And now you got the Japanese attacking Hawaii, which is basically the United States. And because I don't think Hawaii was a state at that point yet. They became a state shortly after that. But, so like nothing is really too ridiculous at this point. Nothing is off the table. And the White House, I'd like to think they're working overtime. Not a lot of sleep happening. And they're just accepting any ideas. And I would like to think, just like at like 4 a.m., after like a 20-hour bender of just constant going over, they come across this dude's letter. And it's like, oh yeah, we can strap bats. I think bats roost. That's very scientific, and God, we do believe in God still. So, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why bats exist either. Yeah. Okay, let's do it. Mr. President, we want to design a bomb, stuff it with bats that have incendiaries attached to them on timers. We're going to release the bomb over Tokyo in the middle of the night. The bats are going to roost in the buildings. The bombs are going to go off first thing in the morning, and the buildings will burn to the ground. Mr. President, do you approve? Yeah, of course I do. My appendages are noodly at this point. I'm bound to a wheelchair. I'm a vegetable at this point in my life, almost. Do whatever you want. I don't care. I'm not going to live to see it, probably. So the Air Force takes Adams' plan and puts together this ragtag team of workers that more so resembled the cast of like an action comedy than real life. All right. The group consisted of a mammologist, a guy who studies mammals. Fine. It's pretty standard. All right. A former gangster, because I don't know, DEI, I guess. A hotel manager, and Tim Holt, who was an actor who starred in 46 low-budget Western films. And they are going to figure out how to stuff a bomb full of bats and burn down an entire city. Okay, the team was streamlined into the Air Force service and promoted to non-commissioned officers. After studying several species of bat to determine which one could blow up the best, the Mexican free-tailed bat was chosen. So Adams, he is also part of this. He helps in the team's project research. He contacts the National Park Service to get permission to harvest as many bats as he could from government property, while the team recruited chemist Louis Pfizer to decide on which incendiary to use. Pfizer, who had just invented napalm, the thing that we used to splatter all over Vietnam and Laos. Yeah, that. He offered his new substance up, which was immediately chosen for use in this bomb. The team then determined that each individual bat could carry roughly 0.6 of an ounce of napalm inside a small cellulose container that could be glued to the front torso of each bat. And then lastly, as part of this plan, the team created metal tubes that could hold more than 1,000 bats at a time that could be dropped from an airplane flying at 4,000 feet. So now comes the test phase of the project. We're already past R&D for a bat bomb. We're in testing now. And things did not go well. Shockingly, right? On May 15th, 1943, the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base was set on fire. The whole base was set on fire when a horde of armed bats was accidentally released and roosted under a fuel tank, which subsequently exploded. Way to go, guys. After the incident, the project was transferred over to the Navy, who, I mean, if we're going to be honest, they're probably a little bit more on top of things than the Army is. The Navy quickly passed it off to the Marine Corps, because the Navy was smart enough to know they didn't want anything to do with it. The Marine Corps, they, even if it's ridiculous, they are up for anything, and they're going to do a great job with it. So they constructed a mock Japanese city at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, and they ran a full test, and they actually felt pretty good about the results that they got. Like, this bat bomb actually worked, which is even crazier of a statement to say. That some crazy dentist in Pennsylvania was like, God designed bats to kill the Japanese. And then that has transformed into the Marines constructing a fake Japanese city and dropping a mock bat bomb over their fake Japanese city and then having the bomb blow up the Japanese city. And it all works. One observer from the National Defense Research Committee remarked that the bat bombs were more effective than standard incendiary bombs that they were using at the time. Whereas regular bombs could, like, at best start maybe like 400 fires, these bats could start nearly 5,000 individual fires. Unfortunately, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King was told that the bat bombs themselves wouldn't be operational until 1945, and he needed them like yesterday. So he cancels the project, which was smart. Not necessarily the best reasoning. You know, it's like, oh, they're not going to be ready for 2 more years? Screw that. Not, hey, this is ridiculous and is going to open up a giant can of worms that will absolutely destroy the ecosystem far more than us dropping an atomic bomb ever would. Here's what's crazy. By now, the United States government had already spent $2 million on this project and had killed tens of thousands of bats to test this out. The project was actually ultimately replaced by the Manhattan Project. So, like, that's wild, right? Like, we go from bat bomb to nuclear weapons. That the bat bomb was the predecessor to the atomic bomb. This is wild. Anyway, you want to get crazier? Here you go. In the early 1940s, around the same time that the bat bomb is being researched and tested, George Kistiakowsky, a chemistry professor at Harvard, became very unhappy with how little Americans knew about the wonderful and totally safe world of explosives and propellants. So, all right, maybe. So, thanks to James B. Conant, the president of Harvard at the time, Kistiakowsky was chosen as the technical director at the Bureau of Mines Laboratories in Brewston, Pennsylvania. None of this means anything to you yet, but we'll get there. At this Bureau of Mines, Kistiakowsky created an industrial process to develop large amounts of RDX, which is an explosive chemical compound often used with TNT to create various munitions, explosives, all that kind of stuff. Well, in 1943, Kistiakowsky was asked to come up with a new explosive that Chinese guerrillas could then smuggle through Japanese checkpoints. That is a real statement, and that is a real thing that used to happen. The United States was trying to team up with China to smuggle explosives into Japan to really F the Japanese up, because we're tired of the Japanese at this point. So much so that we're working with China. And granted, I think we had always been cool with China up until after World War II. Like, not until they became communists did we have a problem with them. I don't know. I could be wrong on that. Either way, Kistikowski then mixed HMX, which is a very powerful explosive, with RDX and flour to create a new edible compound that could even be used in cooking, which means like it didn't necessarily explode under the heat, created at cooking temperatures. And then, because basically his new concoction looked like pancake mix, he called it Aunt Jemima and sent it off to Washington, D.C. So, the Office of Strategic Services, which later became the CIA, they were responsible for coming up with the most ridiculous plans possible during World War II. And they were extremely happy when Aunt Jemima showed up at their disposal, because they quickly put it to work into their schemes. Stanley Lavelle, who was the head of the OSS and the government's own proclaimed Professor Moriarty, who was named, after the evil villain in the Sherlock Holmes stories. The government literally had a guy that they just called Professor Moriarty for fun because he was like the evil villain character in Sherlock Holmes. That was USA, USA, USA. That was the reality of life in the 40s. We just had a supervillain working inside the government, coming up with as many crazy schemes and plans as possible. So this guy took as much of Aunt Jemima as he could. But after one of his scientists got a case of severe diarrhea after making a batch of muffins with Aunt Jemima, Lavelle reasoned that maybe he had too much explosive material in more ways than one, and just decided that he was just going to get rid of it. All right. Probably wasn't able to put enough of the explosive material inside the muffins to make it deadly. And because it was already making people sick, they probably wouldn't eat it anyway. So let's just get rid of it. Well, rather than disposing of it safely, as one should do with highly explosive materials, this dingling figured it was totally fine to just flush all of this stuff down the toilet. And so after spending most of the morning stuffing all of this highly explosive powder down the toilet, Lavelle received a phone call from a very frantic bomb technician who, granted, had previously told him it was totally okay to flush it to begin with, to immediately stop flushing everything down the toilet. The tech, who had apparently decided to maybe do some actual research into Aunt Jemima after telling Lavelle it was fine to flush it, realized that the compound could actually react with the organic matter inside the sewers and create a massive explosion. According to this bomb tech, if there was enough flammable gas in the sewer, methane, it could blow up the entire Washington, D.C. sewer system and destroy every building in the city, right? Even worse, Lavelle was informed that the sewer line ran from his toilet across the street directly over to the White House. They're sharing plumbing. All right. So here we have another project, thankfully, that did not go completely awry. But you've basically created edible bomb powder. They decide, okay, maybe it doesn't really work. We're just going to flush all the powder down the toilet. The water will dissolve it. It's probably fine to just go back into nature. Ugh, that's problematic anyway. But there was a very real possibility that this powder would react with the methane in the sewer system and all of the sewage down there and essentially blow up the entirety of Washington, D.C. The White House, gone. Capitol Building, gone. Washington Monument, if it was built yet, I don't know, gone, right? Like all of the big important government buildings, gone because the evil villain in the CIA, the Professor Moriarty in the CIA, flushed a bunch of edible pancake bomb powder down the toilet. That would absolutely make America lose all respect across the world forever and ever, right? Because it's like, how do you come back from that? You know, like 50 years later, you're going to try to assert yourself again as a world superpower, and all the countries are like, hey, yeah, remember when you blew up your own capital with edible bomb powder. Okay, guys, sure, right? So, but here's what's even crazier, right? Rather than warn everyone that the city could potentially explode, including the president who was over hanging out in the White House, Lavelle just kind of, wiped his hands up and just acted like nothing happened. And he just kind of he just kind of goes home and he's just kind of nervously waiting for the explosion to happen. He's just resigned to the fact that he has just blown up Washington, D.C. Fortunately, obviously nothing ended up happening, and Lavelle abandoned the work on Aunt Jemima so that he could pour all of his attention and energy into his absolute favorite project, which was an attempt to make Hitler grow breasts by lacing his food with estrogen. That is also a very real thing that the CIA tried to make happen during World War II. Obviously, that didn't work either. But oh God. Our next story, it's not really getting that much better. Also in 1943, OSS agent Ed Salinger decided it would be a great idea to spray paint foxes with luminous paint and release them on the Japanese. Now, why would he do that? So Salinger had spent really almost an insignificant amount of time in Tokyo at one point, and basically took that and fancied himself an expert on Japanese culture. He basically took like a weekend trip to Japan, and then now he's just a social media influencer and thinks that he knows everything there is to know about Japanese culture, right? What's the reality was that the only thing he took away from that trip was that Japanese Shintoists, people who practice the Shinto religion, which is not everyone in Japan, but they held foxes in very high regard, kind of like how Egyptians got the thing with cats, Hindus with the cows, Shinto apparently with the fox, all right? Logically then, the OSS proposed that they build fox kites, or special whistles that sounded like whatever sound foxes make. What does the fox say? And even develop fox musk, because of course people would know what a fox smells like. But none of those ideas were good enough, all right? Because according to Salinger, only inari, which is what they called the foxes there, inari, only inari that glowed was a sign that bad luck was coming soon. It wasn't that you could just see them or smell them or whatever, or that they flew. But if they saw a glowing fox, that's what was bad. So, of course, releasing hundreds or even thousands of glowing foxes all over the Japanese countryside would logically then freak everyone out, sending Japan into chaos and bringing an end to the war because the religious gods have spoken. All of the glowing foxes are here. We should surrender to the Americans. Like, when I say there were no bad ideas during World War II, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Absolute insanity that these were people in charge of leading the country through this. How we won World War II forever will be a miracle to me. And it's honestly because, the atomic bomb. And, how America was just like, yeah, man, whatever, that sounds great, let's do it. And that's what happened. So, somehow, again, like I said, someone with the decision-making authority thought this was a fantastic idea. And Project Fantasia was born. The OSS immediately sent agents all over the world to collect as many foxes as they could find. These foxes were then dunked in radioactive radium paint and, for the official test run, were actually released all over upstate New York to scare people to death. And that is exactly what happened. There were just glowing fluorescent foxes running all through upstate New York, and people were calling in freaking out. And seeing as this plan clearly worked, the OSS then needed to figure out how to actually dump those foxes onto Japan. They couldn't really airdrop them, thanks to previous data from cat bombs that suggested that animals can't actually control where they go after you chuck them out of a plane. So yeah, they also dropped a cat bomb. And guess what? The cats didn't make it, you guys. They apparently cats don't always land on their feet, especially when you drop them from thousands of feet into the air. Instead, they then decided to send a bunch of OSS agents out on a boat to Long Island Sound to just toss the foxes into the water to swim ashore. Although the foxes did make it, they were able to swim to shore to commence the invasion. The paint washed off, and so they just decided it's not going to really work. Other than just if we like invaded Japan and released them out of crates into the wild. And so if we're just going to invade Japan, let's just do it with soldiers and guns and bombs rather than fox. So they abandoned this plan. Probably a good idea. Also, like 1943, a big year for stupidity. This one, a little more logical, I think. In 1943, U.S. Navy ships were struck by air-launched glide bombs and anti-ship missiles from German and Japanese planes. So, in response, the United States has to figure out how to combat these. So they began testing ramjet-powered surface-to-air missiles that could be launched from a distance beyond the range of enemy artillery fire. The kamikaze attacks from the Japanese really forced the U.S. to speed up this research and development of the missiles, which they hoped would achieve a horizontal range of 10 miles, a vertical range of 30,000 feet, and a 30 to 60% kill probability. Basically what that means is they wanted to be able to test a missile that they can shoot from 10 miles away and 30,000 feet in the air and have at least a 30% chance of landing where they wanted it to land, which feels low to me, but maybe who knows. The initial tests were performed in New Jersey and Delaware before moving to Camp Davis in North Carolina, just south of Jacksonville in 1946. The next year, Topsail Island, which I am going to in a couple of weeks as I record this, unless there's a hurricane that cancels that trip. But Topsail Island became the primary testing facility for what came to be known as Operation Bumblebee before moving to the deserts of New Mexico and California in 1951. By 1955, long after the war, so it's like they never got to use this, the United States had developed rocket launchers designed to be placed on battleships. And this new technology was first used in combat during the Vietnam War. In addition to the new missile system, the knowledge acquired during the test at Topsail Island led to the development of the XB-70 Valkyrie and the SR-71 Blackbird, which are two high-speed, high-altitude aircraft that were practically immune to interceptors and enemy radar. The fuel boosters developed during the operation became the basis for the rockets used to launch satellites and space shuttles. So this is one that worked out. That, granted, there were blown up beaches in North Carolina and Delaware and New Jersey, but you know what? That's fine. They recovered. Not everybody needs to go to the beach all the time, and there's enough beach for everybody. So there you go. Back to a crazy one. So when the Russians launched Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957, they effectively took a very large lead in the space race over the Americans. And in response, the Americans understandably freaked out and started to think about all the things they needed to do to close the gap and regain the lead in the space race. So, the following year in 1958, the Air Force decided that the best course of action was to just nuke the moon. Because if the Americans couldn't get to it first, no one should. USA! USA! So, the idea was that the Americans could detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon to create an explosion visible to the naked eye from Earth. And this explosion, in the minds of the government, would boost morale in America. Because look at how powerful America is. We can blow up the moon. And it would simultaneously strike fear in every other country off the planet. Because look at what we can do to the moon. What do you think we could do to you? And you're so much closer than the moon. It also didn't help that rumors were going around that Russia was actually planning something similar to commemorate the anniversary of the October Revolution when Lenin took over the Russian government. So, at that point, Project A-119 was born, and a 10-member team led by Leonard Rifle was assembled at the Armor Research Foundation in Illinois to study how visible the explosion would potentially be and what it might do to the lunar surface. Because here's the thing. Like, we haven't even landed astronauts on the moon. We just kind of see what it looks like from a distance. We don't know what it's like up there. And Carl Sagan, who would later go on to make actual contributions to science, was actually part of this team and was tasked with making mathematical projections of the dust cloud that would be created by the explosion. Although the Project A119 wanted to use a hydrogen bomb, the Air Force turned it down due to how heavy those bombs actually were and concern that if they shot this bomb into space and it missed the moon, that the bomb could then fall back to Earth and do actual damage, which is just crazy how misinformed everybody was about this, right? Because it's like, if you get the bomb out into space, it's probably not going to fall back to Earth as long as you get it up there far enough. I guess maybe if you don't actually get it out of the Earth's atmosphere because it's so heavy, you need a ton of propulsion to get it up. And if it explodes, then the entire planet's very screwed. So instead, the group settled on a smaller, lighter W-25 warhead that yielded 12 times fewer kilotons of power. Still a very powerful bomb, still very much more powerful than the atomic bombs. And then based on their projections, they could easily launch a rocket carrying the warhead at the moon and have it detonate on impact on the shadowed side. So if they did that, the resulting dust cloud would then be illuminated by the sun and be very visible from the Earth. And with the advancements that the Air Force had made on intercontinental ballistic missiles at the time, in part thanks to Operation Bumblebee that we just talked about, Project A119 leaders believed that they could launch this nuclear weapon at the moon as early as 1959. Thankfully, in January of 1959, the Air Force finally realized how insane of an idea this was, and fearing public backlash and the incredible risk of humanity if anything went wrong, Project A119 was canceled. In 2010, it was actually revealed that the Russians did have a similar plan to nuke the moon, but their project was also canceled for the exact same reasons, because it's idiotic. It's absolutely bonkers to nuke the moon. Jesus. Anyway, our final operation story here, whatever, is something that actually still happens today. Since 1974, nearly 500 Special Forces students each year, hoping to earn their Green Berets, are put through a month-long training exercise in which they are tasked with blending into a foreign land and training guerrilla units to liberate this, foreign country. Since a grand total of 0 countries across the globe came on board to allow the United States to send amateur soldiers into their country to stir up a fake rebellion, the government just decided to make up their own country and run the exercise here. So, the United States government developed the People's Republic of Pineland, which was this fictional country comprising of 16 counties in central North Carolina. And rather than hiring actors, because the defense budget's already pretty tight, God forbid there's some room in that, $900 billion bill to pay some actors, the government just decided to let the residents located in Pineland to play the role of the civilians in the politically unstable country who just need to learn how to overthrow their government. To make it really real, the government issued residents a special form of Pineland currency called Dons, which looked like orange-yellow Monopoly money and is signed by Seymour Bombs. See what they did there? It also comes with a real exchange rate to the US dollar. Residents are also given a unique Pineland ID card, and civilians who opt in to participate have their own roles in this exercise. One guy is a rendezvous transport for the trainees. Another plays the role of a fire marshal. The manager of a small diner is their CIA contact. Resident actors are reimbursed only for the cost of gas during the exercise, but they are given full military honors when they die, which is pretty cool, right? Like, you just got some random Joe Dirt Dingling hillbilly in the hills of central North Carolina some trailer trash bozo living on welfare. He's going to get full military honors when he dies because he's helping these Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty soldiers now because Bragg was a Confederate. We got to cancel all the Confederates, so we got to change the military base. Anyway, you get it. That's just wild to me, right? So during this month-long exercise, Special Forces students formulate a plan and perform an airborne infiltration of Pineland. From there, they train civilians in guerrilla warfare using their survival and communication training to eventually overthrow the Pineland government. And in a rural area where people are super duper into guns and paranoid that the real government will soon come in and take them away, certainly nothing could ever go wrong here, right? Well, I think you know what's coming next. In 2002, Moore County Deputy Sheriff Randall Butler pulled over a truck containing soldiers Talis Tomini and Stephen Phelps, as well as one of the civilian actors, after suspecting the group of robbery. The soldiers, thinking that Sheriff Butler was part of the exercise, tried to bribe him with their fake Monopoly money, but that just made things worse. They got into a scuffle. Sheriff Butler sprayed one of the soldiers with pepper spray, and while that was happening, the other soldier grabbed one of the bags from the bed of the pickup truck that they were riding in, which contained a service-issued M4 rifle, and just fled off into the woods. So he's thinking like, oh man, this is all part of the exercise. I'm about to go and engage in guerrilla warfare with some of these quote-unquote enemy combatants. Cool. Well, for then that reason, Sheriff Butler shot and killed the soldier that he was fighting with. He then turned and shot the other soldier twice who had slipped and fallen on his way into the woods. And the military, during all that, they had assumed that Moore County Sheriff's Office and all the surrounding police departments were fully aware that Exercise Robin Sage was happening. They were wrong. Tomini's family settled out of court, and Phelps was awarded $750,000 in damages in 2009. I'm shocked it doesn't happen more often. Maybe the military's gotten better about communicating this, but it's crazy that, not far from where I live, every year, a bunch of potential Green Berets are just dropping into rural North Carolina and carrying out fake military operations.
All done.
All right, there you go. More real government projects in the books. How do we feel about our government? If this was the kind of crazy stuff they were doing in the 1940s and such, what are they doing now? What kind of bonkers stuff are we going to hear about 30 years from now when nothing eventually happens? Like, whatever. But what's going to come out? Oh, that, even though we're currently worried about the Russians and the Chinese controlling elections from TikTok, that it was actually the U.S. government faking, as Russian and Chinese propaganda artists to try to rile up sentiment towards those countries to launch a full-scale nuclear war on those countries. I don't know. Wouldn't put it past them. Anything, here's where I am, honestly. Anything that anyone says, all the Russians are up to this, I'm like, cool, dude. I'm not going to sit here and think that the American government's up to something way worse. No. For every little bot TikTok and Twitter account that a Russian owns to try to influence American elections, that the United States government is doing something 10 times worse in Russia at this very moment. People just don't even stop to consider how just crazy, and it's not like it's evil per se, but we're not innocent. We're not just oh my goodness, why would Russia and China just try to cause trouble with us? It's we're just over here trying to, no, we're doing some stuff. All right. We're not that great, you guys. All right. It's not. All right. And let's recap and see what we learned today as proof that we're not that great.
What did we learn?
Like, I'm going to make this quick, all right? 3 things to show you that, hey, let's slow it down on how great we are. We tried to make a bomb full of bats attached with fire bombs to burn down an entire city, all right? We tried to nuke the moon. We tried to nuke the moon. We were going to do it, but because we were worried that we couldn't actually get the bomb all the way there, not worried that we were going to throw the moon off its orbit or completely destroy it. We were worried that like the bomb just wouldn't get out of the atmosphere and it would hurt us. Okay. And then we painted foxes with radioactive glowing paint because a small sect of religious Japanese people, the Inari. Oh, it's a growing Inari. We are in trouble. Surrender to the American. We thought that was going to happen. And we tried to make it happen. And it didn't work out. Jesus Christ.
What did we learn?
Next week on Our Weird World, we are doing part 4 of some wacky wars. We are looking at how Patrick Murphy messed around with the Mexican War. We're also looking at the pastry war and the ice cream war. Yeah, those are real things that happened in history. It was real stupid. So come back next week to learn about those. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends. Don't trust the government and keep it weird.
This is a podcast